So we got this new course started really for real last week. We went through some basic terminology that we should be aware of. What is science? Get some definitions in place. That's always important for understanding something. It maybe should go without saying, but getting your definitions down are important to make sure people aren't talking past each other. And I think as we looked at the way that Scott presented some of the people who historically, a little smattering of definitions that have been there, you recognize you could easily be talking past people if you're not working kind of with same definitions. So definitions are always important for having a useful discussion about something. We took a look then regarding what we think we know or don't know, where reason fits into everything. But we also helped try to narrow that definition down some too. But where reason fits on all of this was another thing that we spent some time looking at, and study of the 38th chapter of Job, where God comes to Job and says, "Hey, buddy, what do you think you know? You need to have a certain humility," and that's true both as we approach Scripture and as we approach science. And hopefully we can carry that through the course as well. So that's about where we left off last time. A little bit more into how the scientific method works today is really the next step. And Scott can take us from there this morning.
Sure. Thank you, Pastor. Okay. So like Pastor said, in this lesson, before we move on with the rest of the Bible study, we're really trying to just lay some of the groundwork. And, the scientific method, I think, is, probably fairly familiar to everyone, but it's still a useful place to start in talking about, how do scientists actually, learn new things about the world and approach things in science. And here we can kind of distinguish between this textbook definition, which, I don't know, maybe we learned is this like a middle school thing typically? Like maybe, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, somewhere in there that you first see the scientific method. So, this really starts with like making observations generally, right? So the idea is, okay, I saw something and this is interesting, right? I made some observation about the world around me. And then in science, scientists are really, really great at asking questions, right? Why? Why did this happen? And I think little kids kind of do this very naturally. Well, why? Why is that? Well, why is that? Well, why is that? My nephew asks questions like that all the time. And, in science, I guess, some of us maybe never grow past that stage, and we're just, always asking why. And then the next step is to, if we want to answer that question, what the scientific method tells us is, well, the next step is to form a hypothesis, right? An educated guess for why this is happening. Well, we try to come up with explanations, and, if we'd ask Mac, my nephew, for his explanation for, things that are going on, it would probably be a lot different than what we come up with as adults, but, he's forming his own hypothesis. And then the next step is to, ideally, if we form a hypothesis, it should make some predictions, right? If we say, well, this is a thing that I'm seeing that's happening, this is why I think it's happening, this is my hypothesis. So if that's true, then I should be able to make some predictions and, either find some evidence in support of that hypothesis or evidence that contradicts it and says, well, maybe that explanation wasn't the best to begin with. So if my hypothesis is correct, I expect to see, this certain thing. Interestingly, in my job at OU, as a university professor, like a big part of my job is to, bring in funding so I can actually do research, and both writing proposals and reviewing proposals from other scientists. I mean, very often on like review panels that I've served on, people will say, well, this proposal's fine, but either it doesn't have hypotheses, so it's kind of, very like descriptive, but there isn't a hypothesis there, or, sometimes the hypothesis might not be very good, that you don't have these testable predictions, and like, okay, well, if this is the case, what do you expect to see? So, I mean, sometimes, people argue about that. Is it a good hypothesis or not? Then, this testing predictions is probably what people think about the most, when they think about scientists. It's when I was growing up, I had this picture of, somebody in a white lab coat sitting in a laboratory looking through a microscope, right, or doing some kind of experiment. And if we have this hypothesis that makes predictions, we have to test it somehow. And what this looks like depends on, it's different between different scientific fields, right? So in some fields, you can actually go and do a laboratory study where you can control most of the variables. I mean, ideally, you could control all the variables, but in a lot of cases, you can't actually do that. So in some fields, you can do laboratory studies. In other fields, right, you just have to collect observations where they're at. So if you study earthquakes, it's pretty hard to do laboratory studies of earthquakes, right? If in my field, in meteorology, I mean, there are some people who do really small-scale laboratory experiments, but generally you just have to collect observations, right, and take real data of the atmosphere and use this as a basis for testing your predictions. Nowadays, that we have such powerful supercomputers, instead of actually doing a physical experiment, people do a lot of computer simulations, and that's part of the work that I do. A lot of your weather forecasts, right, comes from these big computer weather prediction models, and that's used in place of real data, or sometimes combined with real data, which can create a certain set of challenges in how you interpret it. It's only as good as how well you represent the actual thing that you're trying to model. So if you leave out important processes in a model, or
the general
some
circulation model.
Yeah,
and these
exactly.
National labs of supercomputers that everybody works off
Exactly.
of. And the Europeans, of course, they're better than ours, so
That's
should
right.
probably nuke them. And
Yeah, the European model is, they just have difference in funding, and they're way ahead of what we can do in the U.S.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So after testing predictions, right, then you can kind of see that the flow chart splits off here, right, and you can go in one of a couple of directions. So maybe the results from our experiment, if they support your hypothesis, that's great, right? And we can take this left path and go towards, developing a more general theory that explains what we see. But maybe the experiment, it doesn't support a hypothesis. And in that case, we have a few options, right? Maybe we can say, well, my initial educated guess wasn't quite right, so I'm going to refine it a little bit, change the way that I'm interpreting things, and then I'm going to go back down here and do another experiment, test that out, right? And this, cycle is how we learn things in science. In other cases, right, maybe we say, well, there's these things we didn't account for, so we have to be more general and expand our hypothesis to account for other things. In other cases, we might say, well, no, I was totally wrong. We have to reject this hypothesis, right? Go back to the drawing board and completely start over from the beginning. But then, the idea is to get up here and develop general theories, which lead back into what I even am interested in observing in the first place. So that's, kind of the textbook definition of the scientific method that, at least I think is, still taught in school as far as I know. I think the real picture is a little bit more complicated in practice, actually. So, if you would draw a flow chart, it's kind of all over the place, I would say, and it depends a little bit on the discipline that you're in, and it depends on the individual question that you're asking, and different scientists have different styles of approaching things. And in some fields, you might have this great data set, and you might do some exploratory data analysis, looking at the data before you can even figure out what the right questions are to ask. I remember talking with my master's and PhD advisor about this in graduate school, and when he said that, I thought it was a little bit strange, because I was like, I was thinking, well, isn't this not how the scientific method is supposed to work? But in that sense, you're kind of making observations based on what you find in the data to even find interesting questions to ask. A couple of other, things that are on this slide that weren't on the previous one is the very first one up here, these presuppositions. So what you assume to be true before you even, walk into the laboratory or, start thinking about going through this process of science. And it's, basically impossible to do science without having these presuppositions, right? So, I'll get to some examples on these on the next slide, but, this is always part of the process that, is intertwined with applying the scientific method. And of course, for those of us who are Christians, we'll have different presuppositions than someone with a secular worldview. Another thing that, is kind of intertwined with the scientific method is this logical reasoning, right? So we've been talking about the use of a reason, and, the scientific method is good and well, but you have to interpret the results you get, right? And you can follow deductive reasoning, so kind of go through this chain in logic, and there's whole courses in logic that philosophy departments teach. So if A implies B and B implies C, right, you go through this chain of logical reasoning. In science, we use a lot of inductive reasoning, and it's more, based on something that's probabilistic, right? So you say, well, okay, I see this, this, and this. What is the most likely thing that can be causing this, right? So it's a little bit, fuzzier, a little bit more nebulous than this deductive reasoning. And really in science, there's a place for both of these.
Sounds like geometry.
Yes. Yeah. I never liked geometry in school. It was my least favorite math course out of all the math courses that I've taken. And another thing too, right, especially in, really any field of science, right, is using probability and statistics to interpret the results and, to be quantitative and actually put, numbers on things instead of just, descriptive. And we have a lot of statistical tools at our disposal now, which, sometimes they're used well and sometimes they're misused. So as we go throughout this course, this idea, there we go, of presuppositions is really an important one, because, a lot of things that we'll talk about in coming weeks as we go through the first few chapters of the book of Genesis, right? For us as Christians, we have very different presuppositions than a secular atheistic scientist who has a completely different worldview. Now, not that presuppositions are necessarily bad, right? And some of these are things that you kind of need to even, do science to begin with. So, some examples, right? One is that we can trust our senses, right? What we observe. If you read a lot of philosophers, they would argue that you can even trust your senses and kind of go down what I think are some very strange rabbit holes, right? Are you actually observing the world, or are you Neo in the Matrix, and what you see isn't actually what you observe isn't actually what's there. The second one, the universe is orderly and can be understood, right? So in trying to make sense of the world around us, we have this presupposition that we can do so, right? That the universe is an orderly place and we can actually make sense of it. This third one, if you're in, the field of physics, you assume, you have this presupposition that the laws of physics are the same everywhere, right? That if we do an experiment here in Norman, Oklahoma, you would get the same results as in Chicago or Tokyo or Beijing or Nebraska. And imagine, how difficult it would be if, you move from out of state to Oklahoma and like, okay, here's the Oklahoma physics textbook. Here's how the laws of physics work here. That's very strange, right? And so it's a presupposition that the laws of physics are the same everywhere. Now, we can test this out in, different places, but how about on, the planet Jupiter? How about in a different galaxy, right? We don't have a way of testing out this presupposition, but it's still assumed to be true. And the second point here is probably the most key thing of all. So a lot of these presuppositions are not things that can be proven, either by science or by philosophy. And even in the secular world, people who, don't believe Scripture, just completely secular scientists, they take these presuppositions on faith, and they just say, well, this is something I assume to be true, and maybe they don't even realize that these are presuppositions that they have to begin with. So that kind of leads into this next question, which is, a good thing to think about and discuss. What other presuppositions, in addition to those mentioned on that slide, are things that many unbelieving scientists have?
Science and religion are always at war.
Okay.
For all time in all places. So science is the trusty warrior beating down the illogical thousands of German students in the Middle Ages who went to the university that was sponsored by the church.
Okay. So kind of the idea that people will say, well, science, I have this logical, reasonable, enlightened approach, right? And they tend to place it over spiritual matters, right? What we only can learn by faith. Anything else?
I think the supposition that a secular science might have is that the important things in life are well defined, mathematically certain, whereas other people, you might say, well, loving your family or something, that's all uncertain, but it's very important. So some important things, some things are hard to predict, but their importance isn't how easy they are to predict. It's because it has some other importance or something.
So it kind of goes back to like being able to like observe something directly, right?
It's all the guy said, you lost your keys. Well, where did you lose your keys? Over there across the street. Well, why are you looking here? Because the light's better. I'm under the street light, and it's the best place to look. So
yeah,
So I mean, anyway.
Yeah. A few other things that I wrote down, other presuppositions. So, many secular scientists discount completely the existence of God or the, even considering anything that's supernatural that contradicts things that they observe in physics, right? And if one goes down that path, then you say, well, there's no miracles, no virgin birth, no resurrection.
No creation.
No creation. That's right. We'll talk about this in a couple of weeks, but, a presupposition that many scientists have is that, thinking about like the age of the world and, tree rings and ice cores and things like that is they assume, well, everything kind of happens at the same pace that we see now, right? So things in geology are very, very slow. So they rule out anything sudden and catastrophic like a global flood.
Or an asteroid.
Sure.
creating the moon by anyway.
Yeah, anything like sudden and catastrophic. And I think, there's also this presupposition, that you'll hear very often. People say, well, if you look at things in the past, people were uneducated and kind of dense, and we're so much smarter now in modern times.
We have more knowledge, we're not more intelligent.
Right. Okay, so a few more things on how science works. So, kind of this question of how do we even choose a hypothesis to begin with, right? So there's kind of this idea, if the hypothesis doesn't explain what we see, it's pretty much worthless, right? It's not useful for doing anything with. The second point is the testable predictions, right? So this is a thing that will get you in trouble if you're writing a proposal and you don't have a good hypothesis, it doesn't have these testable predictions, then reviewers will complain a lot, right? You probably won't get funded. The third one is kind of an interesting thing, right? You may have heard of Occam's razor before. There's William of Ockham in the late 1200s. And he basically said, well, if everything else is equal, the simplest explanation is the best. And in science, the implication is that if you have, different hypotheses to explain the same thing, it's probably preferable to choose the one that is simpler. Einstein is this quote from Einstein is often used as well. He says everything should be made as simple as possible, but not any simpler. Now, what is simple as possible and what is too simple, I think is open to a bit of interpretation, right?
What's simple to a mathematical physicist or a particle physicist may not appeal to us as being very simple.
Right.
But,
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah, and if you think about it, like, is there any reason that the simplest explanation has to be the best one? Not necessarily, right? So I think just on logical grounds, maybe, you can kind of argue in favor or against Occam's razor. Maybe the one thing it has going for it is that if you have a simpler hypothesis, it's going to be easier to test. If you have a very simple explanation, it's easy to design experiments and find evidence in support or against it. And if you look at the history of science, there's a lot of examples that are kind of in support of Occam's razor. So it can be useful, but I'd say it's more of a general principle that may or may not be true.
He had a lot. I think he was a philosopher. He had a guy that had a lot of other philosophical ideas or schools and stuff behind him. Not that I have any clue what they were, but.
Right. I mean, I think we talked about it when I took a course in college on history of science, but it's a long time ago. Fourth, in choosing a hypothesis is the idea of falsifiability. So if you get into like different philosophers of science, Karl Popper up here on the slide is one whose name comes up a lot. And basically he says, well, does your hypothesis make predictions that you can prove to be false, right? So if I say, well, all swans are white, is that something that I can prove to be false?
Yeah.
Sure, right? There's black swans that are out there, not super common, but they exist, right? So if you find one of these black swans, you can prove that hypothesis wrong. Well, this idea of falsifiability, is evolution something that's falsifiable? According to scientists?
No.
Not according to scientists, right? What evidence would you have to show them so they'd say, well, this disproves evolution?
You can't.
But it's not continuing, though.
Well,
I
they
would think it would.
so they would
Very
argue
slow pace.
they would argue, well,
Very slow
there is
pace.
this microevolution, and this was like Darwin and the Galapagos Islands, and he said, well, if you go to different islands, the finches have different types of beaks. And some of them eat seeds, so they have big, thick beaks so they can eat seeds. Some eat insects, so they have narrow little beads so they can, stick their beak in, like, holes in trees.
And I believe it's true, and this may be a question for the pastor to answer, but aren't most churches these days moving towards the idea that God set into motion evolution? God, well, I know for sure some of the progressive ones are, but
Yeah, I mean, they're...
I just didn't know.
So understand the question is not, is evolution true? That's not the
Yeah.
question on the board. That's not what we're discussing. The question is, as a scientific theory, could you do research that would prove it false? That's the question. It's a completely different question. It's not even, doesn't even embrace the idea, is it true or not? And the idea that I think Scott is getting at is that because of the nature of it, because of where it is in time, you can't go back there. Did humans descend from some ape-like creature? You can do no experiment that would prove that true or false. It's a supposition. But you can't go back in time and do the lab work on it. It's not possible. It's not falsifiable. That's the point.
So you're saying its validity is based on whether it's falsifiable or not?
Well, I mean, that's what, Karl Popper and some scientists would say, right? So they would say, well, if you want to form a hypothesis, it should be falsifiable, that you can prove that it's wrong and then move on and choose a different hypothesis.
If it were wrong.
If it were wrong.
Yeah.
That's right.
So field geology is like, if you look at one landscape or something, I was told by this guy at a secular university. Anyway, and so it has multiple levels of causation going on to produce that landscape and stuff. And the truth is, there's so many different possible explanations for that landscape that you're looking at and walking over and mapping with your hammer, that you really can't give an explicit explanation. You can give an overall descriptive idea that includes as many of these factors that you think you can have a clue about, because it's so incredibly complicated that you can't be like, okay, I hit the billiard ball at this point and it takes it at this point and so on and so forth. So really complicated things like that are like, they have it requires a different approach to doing, anyway, okay, I'm making excuses for it, but basically, it's a very complicated thing.
I mean, it kind of goes back to that idea of inductive reasoning, right? So someone would take, okay, I see all these factors, what's the best explanation for what I see?
Scott, how does that differ where you're looking at something that points to it being false versus somebody pointing to observations that show that it's true? Because it seems like to me, like today when you see the distinction between, say, macroevolution and microevolution, they'll throw in micro as a testable observation to point to the truth behind macro. Does that make that question make sense?
I think so. So the idea of, kind of going back, right, this is, a lot of people in science would say that a hypothesis being falsifiable should be a condition for any hypothesis that you choose to pursue. And yeah, I'm not...
So adding like back to your beaks on Darwin and the Galapagos or wherever he's testing these things, micro adaptations they use all the time, saying this is a mutation that benefits the animal. So of course macroevolution has to be true because we can observe adaptations now that
Survival of the fittest.
make it look like it's true.
But, I mean, like we were saying, it's like kind of a big leap, right? To go from like beaks on finches to say, okay, well then, therefore humans evolved from an ape-like creature, right? Which is not falsifiable, because what evidence would you need to prove that false?
The missing link.
Just, from a completely scientific perspective. Does that answer your question?
And I think that kind of proves the point to me that you've got to have the falsification, not just some kind of proof that this is true, right?
But, I mean, if you look at some hypothesis to explain something in whatever field, I mean, and especially you, hopefully, if it's your own hypothesis, you should sit down and every week or so write down your list of assumptions and find one to beat up on for one day. And, you know, but you want to say, okay, yeah, that's my hypothesis that this is explained this way. How could I be wrong? You know, and think of some ways you could be wrong. If, you know, that's an exercise you should go through, you know, right up there with, you know, pulling your own fingernails out or something.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's, you know, it's good to do, and I think in a very idealistic sense that's something every scientist should do. But there's also a lot of external pressures, right? So
You can't write grants all day and sit around and angst about.
well, right. In
being wrong
academia,
every time.
we have this saying, publish or perish, right? So, you know, if you start university and you're a tenure track faculty and you go out for tenure in like 6 years and you have no publications to your name, you're not going to stick around, right? You're not.
You have to go fast enough fast enough, and you can't look around and see where you're going. And
Yeah, so there's pressure to publish, there's pressure to bring in grants, there's, you know, pressure to be the first one to, you know, publish on a topic or discover something before your competitor, you know, at, you know, Oklahoma State does.
well, I mean, sometimes you see
You're
like
at OU.
medical. It's like they're going so fast to compete with the other people that they could just run straight into a wall, you know, headlong, you know, because they just can't afford the time to look around and see what they're doing and things. Which
Right.
maybe you're in the middle of a war and you're making a fuse or something, that might be okay.
So not to jump too far ahead or
Blowing our
take us too much on a tangent. Maybe this comes up later in the course, or we'll insert it. But read an article recently by Princeton PhD, I believe, David Galertner, who has written an article. He's not a Christian. He's not a deist or theist even, but wrote an article that would seem to indicate, in his opinion, Stephen Meyer's work on statistics has basically Darwin has fallen. The whole idea of positive mutations, what it takes to get one of those in nature is it's 1 to more than the total number of atoms in the universe to get one positive mutation, the chances. The statistical chance of getting one positive mutation is 1 to more than the total number of atoms in the whole universe by factor of exponential numbers. Such that, he says, it's the scientists will still say, well, you haven't proven it false, but he says it's done. We need to go to the next thing. He's not a fan of creationism nearly. Doesn't even like the idea of intelligent design, again, because it puts you outside of science. But he says Darwin is done.
It's not over. That, you know, I mean, there's. Well, I saw something in this thing that Michael Gias's institute and stuff, and they had a lecture on genetics, and they were saying that there's this hidden DNA that's not expressed in every organism, and they were saying that if you sequence this hidden DNA that's not being expressed, which is, you know, that you kind of think it would follow the same rules of descent, you know, and there would be relatedness between different organisms, but it turns out there isn't. In fact, there's the difference between these unexpressed parts of the genetic material are so vast, they have at a loss to find any way to explain them, you know, other than, I guess, you know, Christianity, you know, God creating them. But I don't know. I mean, I just saw that. And
Yeah, we'll circle back to this. Is this lesson 3, I think? We'll come to this more. So more on this soon. Okay, so this idea that, you know, scientific theory should produce testable, falsifiable predictions. If you look at the history of science, there's like a ton of examples of this. You know, one example, just to choose one, is Albert Einstein who came up with the theory of general relativity. So his papers were first published in the early 1900s, 1915. And basically, you know, what Einstein said is he said, well, you know, he went one step further beyond Isaac Newton, and he said, well, space and time are related and interconnected to each other, so you should think about space-time as one thing. And if you have mass, a lot of mass or energy, this distorts space-time. So, you know, kind of the idea of, you know, a planet with gravity is like a bowling ball sitting on a rubber sheet, that space-time kind of bends in towards that, and he has very complicated equations, you know, even according to what I do to describe this. But, you know, kind of the key thing here is that general relativity actually made testable predictions. Specifically, it predicts that if you have enough gravity, it'll actually bend or distort light, which is very different from what Newton would say and, you know, earlier people in the history of science. And there was actually observational support found for general relativity 4 years after Einstein published his paper. During a solar eclipse, observations were made by Sir Arthur Eddington. This figure here shows what people now call an Einstein ring. So you can see a couple of stars here, and you have these like blue circles on the outside. So this is basically the light from like galaxies or stars behind them bending around them because their gravity is distorting light. I think this is from Hubble Space Telescope.
That's
You know,
also
from a
how
few
we're,
years
like,
back.
See further, like that distortion is like acts as like a lens, like of a glass, and you're able to see further back. Is that true?
Yes. So you can kind of, because the light is bent around objects, sometimes you can sort of see around them.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. So just one example. So going one step further, there we go. So, you know, we talked about the scientific method. In practice, it's a little bit more complicated, and there's these presuppositions, right? This logical reasoning that in the textbook definition you don't necessarily think about. But then there's deeper issues at play here. If you look at science from a historical perspective and kind of look at how, you know, these different hypotheses and theories have developed over time. So Thomas Kuhn, who was at the University of Chicago, he was a historian and philosopher of science, and in the 60s he published this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, kind of arguing that, you know, you can be a scientist and you can have the best intentions in the world, and you can be, you know, doing things rigorously and ethically, but still how you do research is determined by your paradigm. So we have a definition here. A paradigm, he defines as a model of understanding that provides researchers in a field with viewpoints and rules on how to look at the field's problems and how to solve them. And the key things to note here are that your paradigm tells you what is even worth observing in the first place, right? So, you know, going back to the previous example, if you didn't have Einstein with this theory of general relativity, no one would think to look for this bending of light around stars, right? If, you know, if Newton had been had access to observations like that, that's not even a question he would have asked. The paradigm determines what questions you ask and how you ask them, and how you should interpret your results. So when I was at Martin Luther College, I took Professor Sponholz's History of Science class, and he always described paradigms as, you know, you can kind of think of it as the umbrella that's kind of, you know, over top of everything as you're, you know, doing science, so it kind of, you know, determines everything and you don't really venture outside of that. Or you can think of it as like a pair of glasses through which you see the world. You know, we have this saying to view the world through rose-colored glasses, right? Well, if you have rose-colored glasses versus yellow or green or blue, you're going to see and notice different things. So here's kind of a idea of that Kuhn sets out in how paradigms work in the history of science. So if a field is very, very new, there might not even be a paradigm to begin with. And no one agrees, Pastor talked about the importance of definitions, and people might have, different definitions for the same things, no real agreement on how to even go about studying something. And then over time, and there's a lot of examples you can find in the history of science, but there's all these like competing paradigms, and one is selected, and it kind of guides how science progresses going forward. So this is what we call normal science, and then in a lot of fields it gets to the point that there are anomalies that your paradigm, all of your overarching assumptions and presuppositions have a difficult time explaining. And from here, this is another place where we split off in the flowchart. Either, you can refine your hypotheses and say, well, there's this thing that we missed and we need to account for, or you'll question the assumptions of the paradigm itself. And this is, the scientific revolution that Kuhn talked about in the title of his book. And then there's a paradigm shift, so that a new paradigm is proposed, and most people in the community adopt it, and the cycle starts over again. So, kind of the key thing is that the old and new paradigm are completely different worldviews, right? If I'm standing over here and I have like blue colored glasses and somebody has orange colored glasses, we aren't even going to agree on the things that we're seeing or what we should be looking at to begin with. And a new paradigm can't be proven by the rules of an old one. So it really, when we have these paradigm shifts in the history of science, it changes the meaning of terminology, the questions that scientists ask, the rules that are used to test a theory, so many, many different things. And, like I said, even if you're, completely ethical, very, very careful, you're still influenced by your paradigm in how you see the world and the questions you choose to ask. And in my own job, right, in my own doing research, if I write a proposal, it's based on things that I learned in graduate school. It's based on other papers in the field. It's pretty uncommon if I come up with this, completely different explanation for things. It probably won't fly with peer reviewers if I submit a proposal or a paper. So let's just, here's one example. So if we ask the question of what causes diseases, one example of a paradigm shift. So you have Galen, you have Hippocrates, and back in, early hundreds AD, 300 or 400 BC, if you'd ask the question, well, what causes diseases, we had this miasma theory. So people would say, well, we know that disease comes from this bad air. So if you live near a swamp where there's a lot of, decaying plant matter, maybe, animals die there, there's this bad air, this organic matter rots, and there's this plume of this bad air that kind of drifts in, and you need to close your windows at night so that it doesn't get in your house because this miasma is going to make you sick. So there's this quote from Vitruvius. He says, "For when the morning breezes blow toward the town at sunrise, if they bring with them mist from the marshes, and mingled with the mist, the poisonous breath of creatures of the marshes, to be wafted into the bodies of inhabitants, they will make the sight unhealthy." So, at the time, this is how diseases were explained. Now, if we step back, is this like a terrible explanation?
Pretty good. You could make a lot of good horror movies about it.
Okay.
But despite the fact that it would be good Hollywood, no, it's a great hypothesis. I mean, it's a great hypothesis.
Occasionally, I suppose there are airborne organisms that could
Right,
actually work
right.
that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you live next to a dump of dead people and dead things, that's not going to be necessarily.
Well, absolutely.
healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. Because one thing that's said is that disease is related to poor sanitation, right? So people would
Right.
say, well, I'm not going to put my house close to a garbage dump or a, cemetery or any place that, it led to people valuing sanitation and sanitary conditions.
Clean water. What about water? If you live, I don't know.
Well, so that's kind of an interesting point, which we'll get to in just a second. We have to wrap up here soon for the day. But miasma theory really didn't talk about water. It talked about everything being airborne on the wind.
You live in Ohio near a train wreck, you're breathing chemicals.
Right. And this actually explained a lot of observations. So, if you live in a tropical region, right, people found, well, if I have my house shut up at night and I don't have it open to the outside world, I'm not going to get this thing that's called malaria. They said, well, malaria must just drift in on the breeze at night. And now we have a different explanation, right? Because we say, well, it's, the bacterium is borne by mosquitoes, and those are more active at night. So if my windows are open and I don't have a mosquito net, they'll come in the house. But, at the time, this was a pretty good explanation. In the early 1800s, we had a paradigm shift, and we had the advent of germ theory, set forth by Louis Pasteur and a number of others who said, well, actually, it's not just miasma, but there are these microorganisms, right? These tiny, living, multi-celled viruses or bacteria that cause diseases. And if we can kill or stop the spread of those germs, then we're going to stop diseases. So this led to, pasteurization, named after Louis Pasteur, to make food and drink safe, hygiene, right? And, in medicine, this was a big deal. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and apparently in the Civil War, soldiers were told, well, if you want to make your utensils clean and safe for eating, you should rub them around in the dirt, because that cleans them off, which,
Gets the grease off.
but according to germ theory, right, that's maybe not the best.
Wasn't around that same time period there was another scientist who was ridiculed at the time, but said, kind of theorized that you needed to wash your hands. He was a doctor.
Right,
You needed
right.
to wash your hands. Was that at the same time as the Pasteur?
I think pretty close. Yeah, I think around this time.
So it was up until basically the mid 1800s that we realized you need to wash your hands after.
So, kind of one of the big moments in the history of science is in the 1850s in London, England. There was a cholera outbreak, and you might have heard the name John Snow before. He was a physician, and he kind of subscribed to understand that germ theory. Right, there were a number of people before this who said put this forth as an explanation, and John Snow is kind of famous for going and removing the handle from this Broad Street pump for this cholera outbreak, because he saw all these cases were clustered around this pump. And he said, well, it doesn't make sense. This is spreading on the air. It seems to be something coming on the water. And, he followed this idea of germ theory. So, a big shift, right? And it's because of shifting to germ theory that we have vaccines, antibiotics, right? We have a very different approach to treating diseases. Maybe just one question here to close. So, people before this, right, in the 1700s, let's say, who believed miasma theory, were they stupid? Were they uneducated? No. So they were believing the state-of-the-art science for their day.
It fit Occam's razor.
Right. It absolutely did.
What was the proof for these little bitty bacteria?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Did you see them?
Right. Leeuwenhoek invented the microscope in late 1600s, early 1700s, I think. So, prior to that, nobody had evidence of these microorganisms. So, I think very often in the history of science, it's, kind of tempting to look back and say, well, those people they didn't know what they were doing. We're so much smarter and have so much better information now. So it should lead us to be very careful in, how we interpret anything in science today. So we better end here as we're close to the end of our time. We'll wrap up a couple of things with this next time, and then go back again to this topic of reason and the cross.
So, like bacteria and viruses, would they be considered like God's creation, like part of?
Is there anything that isn't?
Well, I mean, like in Genesis, God created talks about the order of created the creatures in the sea, creatures in the land. He created. I mean, are they creatures? I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
So the categories for things made in the book of Genesis are very broad, right?
Uh-huh.
It would appear, whales and dolphins are thrown in there with marlin and sharks. And, they're just sea creatures, right? And then you've got cows and pigs and chicken. You got farm animals, and then the beasts of the field, and then you got wild animals. So the categories are very broad. So someplace they fit in there. And then, I think later in the course we'll talk a little bit. Biblical kinds can't necessarily be lined up, genus, species exactly. We shouldn't over associate those things. So there's some variety there in the idea. All right. All right, thank you. So, we'll get more to Scripture as we go along. We want to lay some basis. One of the things we want to help you get the idea of, science is out there feeling its way along, trying to figure things out, but it's not this body of absolutely determined known things, right? It is this process, and it's had to kind of grope and feel its way along. It still does, but it's not all settled, not nearly.
So it's not set in stone.
So to speak, yes. All right, thank you.